This is the History Hour, back for our 6th episode on our series on Mesopotamia. We return into the final stretch of our overview on the region. Previously, we have spoken of the earliest origins of ancient culture of the Near East, the Neolithic, Copper Age, and Bronze Age kingdoms and empires of Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions. These stretch from the pre-Rhian expeditions and colonization of the Uruk civilization to the rise of central government in the dynastic period, culminating in the first recognized empire in humanity's history, the Akkadian Empire of Sargon, followed by the Uruk III dynasty, before a fresh downturn led to the ascendancy of the Amorites and later the Kassites and Assyrians. In all these millennia, hundreds of dynasties and thousands of individual monarchs, despots, and warlords reigned at varying times and fought countless wars and battles with one another. It was the Bronze Age collapse, however, that changed the face of this region more than any other. While the rise of Sargon and the achievements of Hammurabi or Shogi might have influenced generations upon generations of rulers, the societies they had built were changed irreparably by the migrations of nomadic warriors and decades of decline brought on by drought and internal strife. In the wake of it, in the early Iron Age, Assyria remained a besieged island amid the tumultuous violence, and Babylon changed hands over and over again as different kings seized power, or outsiders broke through the walls to sack the city. In the dark age that followed the collapse, literacy decreased. The largest empires shrank in size and splintered into pieces. Fragments of the Hittite Empire, wounded by the Sea People and finished off by the Phrygians, were fought over by the Assyrians and Babylonians alike until both empires suffered from their own invasions by the Aramaeans and the Sutians. But even as all this occurred, people continued to live their lives. Not every city was reduced to ruin, and most populations were not en masse exterminated. In the middle of this downturn, people were still born to grow old, have their own families, and live as best they could in the same world their ancestors had built and had in turn watched crumble. To a modern audience, unless you have first-hand experience of a failed state like Libya or Iraq, or else areas rife with internal violence like Syria or the Congo, it would surely be difficult to imagine what it must have been like to live in this world. I personally imagine it might be akin to our depictions of an apocalyptic world, where it reduced our grand cities to ruin via nukes, or a scarcity of resources had driven humanity to collective violence in overthrowing society. To look at many Renaissance artworks, there is a fascination with the world living in the ruins of the Roman civilization, where medieval peasants toiled in their fields next to the crumbling megalithic architecture. I imagine it could have been the same in this world, living inside cities that had once housed many times more people, working in fields perhaps near the Kudur land grants of forgotten Kassite lords. Maybe armies marching past dead cities might have wondered about the kings and kingdoms that had once been but were now forgotten. From this bloodshed came the Neo-Assyrians, and then the Neo-Babylonians after them. The mightiest of the Mesopotamian empires were to be the last. The Neo-Assyrians, inheritors to the long traditions of Mesopotamian kings and emperors, emerged from the collapse as the most organized and powerful of the surviving great powers of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean. Perhaps in a response to the world they had now inherited, the Assyrians set about bringing it under their dominion via the sword and holding on to authority with ruthless brutality, reminiscent of some sort of raider chieftain. In the first millennia B.C.E., the meek did not inherit the earth. The question emerges about why exactly was an empire as powerful and militarily successful and economically prosperous as the Assyrians able to undergo this collapse. After all, they didn't have the sea coast be raided by the Sea Peoples. They were not as infected by a possible earthquake storm as somewhere like Anatolia would be, or Greece. And there's a number of ways to approach it. The traditional approach from most of historical perspective, most of historiography, is the sort of top-down approach, the reminiscent of great man history. This king did that, this conqueror achieved this. Tiglath-Pileser was the last great Assyrian king prior to this collapse. He had been especially successful, had subdued a number of enemies, expanded the territory of the kingdom, and generally been one of the most powerful kings of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and of the Near East culture in general up until that point. As you have these very successful, dynamic, intelligent, brave, whatever kings who inspired their people, who were able to organize the empire, whatever combination of factors allow them to be successful in such a extremely high stress and complicated system where they're at the very top of it. Even if that person is especially gifted, perhaps their son, their grandson, their nephew, whoever it is, will inherit the throne, won't be. Or power of the throne, or the loyalty of the armies, or the bureaucracy will just not be in the state it was at that point, at some point in the future. And inevitably, once you have an empire built on so many factors that went right once, it only takes so many factors to go wrong. Tiglath-Pileser's successors were just simply not up to the task of following him. They were just not the kings that he was. But there's also the bottom-up approach. The idea that this is a scenario that would eventually boil over regardless of who the king was. Assyria had spent many years after all conquering their neighbors, extending control. In this period, when there was succession crisis, when there were civil wars, all of these people were essentially, as some would say, looking for an opportunity to shake off the Assyrian yoke and try to reassert their independence. So when you mix these two potential factors together, kings who are not up to the task of their predecessors, of rebellious vassals and unhappy conquered peoples, with a third, a undeniable factor, the outside factor, the Amorians and other nomads arriving, as the migration seemed to be moving many peoples around the region at this time. It was a combination of all of these things slamming into the Assyrian Empire at once. Their kings being unable to cope, the peoples seeking to break away, and just an almost inexplicable, inexorable advance of nomads to the deserts left them in a situation where they could not possibly cope with what they were faced with.
In a lot of ways, it's reminiscent of the system collapse theory we talked about during the Bronze Age collapse in general. A system may be able to handle one or two or even three shocks. Once enough factors pile together, the whole house of cards is going to come tumbling down.
These Aramaeans, which we have mentioned before and will mention throughout this episode, were the newest and most disruptive group to arrive in the Middle East during this period. The Aramaean nomads, which are a major part of this collapse and the dark age that follow. Let's examine for a moment who exactly they are. The first references that we think are directly related to the Aramaeans are to the Alamu, which appears to be more or less a generic term used for a number of nomads coming out of the region of the West Semitic peoples in this time. Around the 18th century B.C.E., the city-states of Uruk and Mari both make reference to the Alamu. As time goes on, other Middle Eastern powers, as well as the Egyptians, reference them. The Aramaeans and Sutians are believed to have been tribes within this group. Much like many groups we've seen before, the Amorites, the Kassites before them, perhaps even like the Akkadians in ancient days, they appear to have been moving little by little, taking over more territory, and serving even in advance of their major territorial changes as migrants, mercenaries, that sort of thing in the greater Mesopotamia era. During their arrival in the mid to late Bronze Age, they began to slowly replace the Amorite lands in the Levant region. In fact, earlier historians had linked the state and the city of Amaru to the Aramaeans, but most likely that instead is an Amorite kingdom that the Aramaeans did eventually supplant. Their arrival coincided with a period in the build-up to the collapse when the drought had been increasing, the dry period was beginning to have effects in these areas, and urbanized populations, primarily of Amorite, Canaanite, Hittite, and Ugarit origin, began to decline, and the settlements there shrank until most of these populations were instead engaging in rural pastoral type practices rather than city-state style governments. The Alamu and tribes like the Aramaeans, with their arrival in the region at the time of declining urbanization, would have even further pushed fierce competition for the scarce resources of the region. Such competition between pastoral groups, both nomadic and those from natively from the region, is a familiar conflict throughout history, which is often described as urbanized versus nomadic pastoralism, a trend you see in Turkish history, Scottish history, much of Middle Eastern history. The annals of Tiglath-Pileser I actually speak of his campaigns and his victories against what he called the Alamu Aramaeans. As time goes on and additional rulers, notably those of Assyria, continue to record these encounters, the term Alamu no longer appears to be used and is increasingly replaced by simply referring to them as the Aramaeans. It is possible that the Aramaeans were simply the most prominent and successful out of these tribes, and that as time had gone on, they had either absorbed their neighbors, or perhaps the Alamu was simply a term that was always used for a group that was predominantly Aramaean. Whatever the case may be, as time goes on, the Alamu as a term for a conglomerate people, a generic term for wandering West Semitic nomads, is no longer relevant. Instead, the Aramaeans with their distinct language and their distinct culture, which do take power and hold much territory throughout this region. As the Middle Assyrian Empire began to shrink due to its various dynastic struggles in the late Bronze Age, the Aramaeans were able to pressure the borders. As they lost more and more vassal territories and provinces, the Aramaeans established themselves new dynasties and kingdoms along the region. The primary area of Aramaean influence was that of Syria and of eastern Assyrian territory, as well as Judea. In fact, there are surviving steles which actually do show non-biblical references to their wars with the house of David, notably those kings Saul, David, and Solomon from the Old Testament. Of the various principalities and kingdoms, the two major states, the two most notable, were those of Aram Damascus and Hamath. Other powerful principalities include Bit Adini, Bit Bahayani, Bit Hadipe, Aram Rehab, Aram Zobah, Bit Zamani, Bit Halupe, and Aram Ma'aka. And the Gambulu, Latah, and Pakudu were notable major Aramaean tribes dominant in this era. At the height of their power, as the Assyrians had waned the most, they were able to move into the Syrian region, seize many of these cities, and butt up to border against the Uruk region, as they also seized some of the broken away Neo-Hittite states. It's interesting because the Aramaeans, with their arrival and their at least partial dominance, temporary insurgence of power, it seems very similar to some of these earlier periods. In fact, they came out of the same region the Amorites did. They replaced the Amorites, and in a very big way, the Aramaeans looked like they could have been poised to be the new Amorites, the new Kassites, the new whatever group it was that came out of seemingly nowhere, who'd only been mentioned a handful of times before. They became suddenly important, and then they would come to dominate Mesopotamia. But the Aramaeans didn't do that. The Aramaeans were certainly dominant. They certainly played a primary, if not principal, factor in the fall of the Babylonian Empire, the Kassite dynasty, and they certainly brought ruin to some of the following Babylon dynasties. And they were extremely influential in the shrinking and the period of decline that marked the end of the Assyrian Empire until the resurgence of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. What seems to have been different, though, is they were never able to consolidate around a single place of power. They were never able to entirely unify. Obviously, the Amorites were never 100% unified either, but certain ones out of them, the kingdom of Mari, Shamshi-Adad of Assyria, if he was an Amorite, certainly Hammurabi of Babylon, those individuals established large, powerful central states which had so much authority and had so much power that they were able to become very dominant. Instead, these various Aramaean principalities continued to war with one another, continued to control notable but relatively small domains, and instead it was a resurgence of an older power. It's not so unlike Sealand trying to re-exert itself, but whereas Sealand never came to entirely replace the Babylonian Empire, Assyria would be able to push these tribes and these principalities back and would be able to remake an old state new again. The Aramaeans are also notable for being the first individuals to introduce camels, at least domesticate camels, into the Mesopotamian region. The first domestication of these animals is believed to have happened around 2000 B.C.E. That more or less roughly corresponds to the Amorite period like we were talking about, but that occurred either in Arabia or in Somalia, the Horn of Africa. The primary pack animal used by the Mesopotamian era would have been the donkey. Camels have a number of distinct advantages over the donkey. Most notable, they're almost entirely adapted for the desert. There's a number of strange adaptations, all the way from their eyebrows to the way their veins can filter the heat from the blood heading to the brain that allows them to survive extremely harsh, extremely warm conditions. But even more notable than that, I think, is the thing that is most well known about camels, their ability to inflate their hump with fat and with water. And as times get hard, and as food and water is hard to come by, they're able to deflate it. They're able to undergo less and less sustenance than almost any other animal. When you're looking at this group of Aramaeans who are coming out of these extremely competitive small bands, fighting with one another and fighting with the locals over resources, we're looking at groups of people who are traveling across the desert or traveling across arid landscapes with potentially hostile enemies in every domain, or at least people who don't view you as a welcome person in their domains, or who view you as a outside invading force, the ability to take these animals, and when so much of your transport capacity is based not only upon how much the animal can carry, but also how much feed you need to bring for, one, the animals carrying that feed, and the animals carrying whatever else you're bringing, whether it be an invasion army on cavalry on horseback, or whether it be a merchant caravan, you've got to put in a dramatic amount of extra animals, extra carts, whatever, in order to make that journey feasible. Whereas if you're talking about these animals, the camels, which are so rugged and so dependable, which can travel nearly as fast as a horse, but have far greater endurance, you're talking about a extremely distinct advantage, especially in a period in which aridity, soil degradation, famine has driven the complex canal networks and the agricultural heartland of Mesopotamia to be an all-time weak point. One of the most distinct, most notable features of the Aramaeans, the thing that probably held on the longest in relation to the original Aramaean culture, is their language. Aramaean language is a West Semitic language. Their alphabet is somewhat derivative of the Phoenician alphabet. This alphabet being significantly easier to use than cuneiform, the old school tapping the stylus in the stone or the clay as we've talked about since the beginning of this show, was adopted by the Assyrians. Essentially, the Assyrians would continue to use their scribes to put in notches on the tablets in order to record Imperial Assyrian Akkadian, but they would also have a scribe writing on papyrus or on leather-bound parchment, Aramaean at the same time. Being a phonetic alphabet rather than a character-based language is significantly easier to use as modern discussions come up around Chinese and the vast amount of characters they have compared to more phonetic languages. Given the ease of it, given how widespread it was, even after the fall of the Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians would continue to use it as one of the official languages, and even the Achaemenid Persian Empire would continue to use it as one of its number of official languages. Most, if not all, Middle Eastern languages which have come after have borrowed or been influenced to some degree by Aramaean, which includes both modern Hebrew and Arabic to some degree. It remained for some time the lingua franca of the region, and in fact, after it was adopted, it was likely used more commonly by individual people inside the empire as the day-to-day mother tongue. Akkadian, while it was still used to some degree and was obviously a not dead language during the time of the Assyrian Empire, it more and more was becoming like Sumerian had in the previous era. Though Sumerian itself still survives as an archaic language used for religious, literary, and scientific use, even in this period and all the way up to the 1st century AD. Sumerian, however, was becoming less used in this era, being replaced more by Akkadian, and Akkadian itself being replaced more by Aramaean. By the time of its disappearance in the 1st century, it would more or less remain a dead language, unused, untranslated, until Assyriologists began studying the Mesopotamian ruins and the language in the 19th century. Assyrian Akkadian, as I said, also began to follow the same path that Sumerian had, and by the time of Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire, it is believed the language had mostly or wholly died out as a spoken dialect and was simply being used as a written language only. It too would more or less disappear by the 1st century AD and be forgotten and dead, waiting for our Assyriologists to rediscover and study it. Aramaean, by contrast, does still have some surviving remnants in today's world. It has mostly been replaced throughout the centuries by the Islamic conquest of the region and the Arabization of the region. But Western Aramaic survives among some very isolated mountain communities in Syria, most notably around Mount Lebanon and the anti-Lebanese mountains in the region. Being so isolated, they were more or less able to survive the Arabization with their culture intact, their language intact, but these groups, as the modern world tends to degrade isolation in all groups, these groups too are shrinking, and there may come a day when they also no longer use that language. Eastern Aramaic, however, is believed to have speakers of somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million today. Most speakers are actually from the modern-day Assyrian ethnic group, but there are some distinct Jewish and Gnostic communities today which still use some form of Aramaic. The Mandeans, which are a shrinking Gnostic sect, is actually one of the last surviving Gnostic sects of antiquity, stretching all the way back from ancient days until the modern day. They use the liturgical language of Neo-Mandaic, whose older form was actually considered influential among several of the surviving Eastern dialects today, and whose modern style still contains some Akkadian words and grammar. But before we jump in entirely to the Assyrians, let's turn back to Babylon for a moment. Babylon, after all, was one of the most powerful entities and had, before the Assyrians began to become more prominent in the late Bronze Age, looked to be the new successor to the Akkadians and into the South Sumerian cultures. It seemed to be the most prominent and powerful of the cities, and yet it did not survive the collapse in the way the Assyrians did. The ecology of Babylon had severely weakened it. The broken trade routes had caused the economy of stress, and likely earthquakes and droughts might have brought additional suffering and economic downturn and the decrease of kingly authority to the Kassite Babylonian dynasty. All of this mixed with, of course, the Aramaeans, the Sutians, and the Elamites arriving in the scene, which culminated in the sack of Babylon we discussed at the end of episode 3, where Shutruk Nanhut, the king of Elam, had marched into Babylonia, claimed his right to the city via marriage alliances, and sacked it and kicked out the Kassite dynasty. From this, Babylon would turn from one set of hands to another over and over again during the era of the collapse. The dynasty that followed the Kassites, called by scholars Dynasty 4, the Dynasty Firmissen, which in and of itself might actually not have been Firmissen. There is some debate whether or not they were Zissin or if it's actually a different word that's been attributed instead due to damage. It's not entirely known, but essentially the most prominent dynasty in power directly after this was potentially Firmissen, and was recognized as Dynasty 4. The first king of it, Marduk-Ahishu, defeated the Elamites and drove them out, more or less Assyria, once again independent Mesopotamian region, but he also came under attack and was ultimately defeated by the Assyrians under Ashur-dan I. His son, Iti-Marduk-Balutu, also defeated the Elamites and kept them from taking more Babylonian lands, but was himself in turn also defeated by Ashur-dan I, who was still pushing Assyrian territorial ambitions. The third king of this dynasty, Ninurta-Nadin-Shumi, was once again also defeated by the Assyrians, this time by Ashur-reshi-ishi. The fourth king of this dynasty, the most famous of this dynasty's kings, Nebuchadnezzar, came to the throne, and he also defeated the Elamites, and he sacked Susa, dealing significant damage to the Elamites. He also recovered that statue of Marduk that everyone seemed to love to cart off. He then, in turn, however, was once again defeated by the Assyrians, this time once more by Ashur-reshi-ishi, when the two of them fought over remnants of the Hittite Empire, which had by this point been utterly wiped out, their imperial core being taken by the figurines. In the final years of his reign, he fortified Babylon against attacks from the Assyrians, Aramaeans, and Elamites. If the collapse had not been fully felt in this period, it was under his son's reign, Enlil-nadir-apli and Marduk-adir-ahi, the land was ravaged by famine, and more of their territory was seized by Tiglath-Pileser. His successor, Marduk-shapik-zeri, signed a peace treaty rather than go to war with the Assyrians. He and Ashur-bel-kala settled their borders and made peace. However, his successor, Kadasman-burius, revolted and then attempted to go to war with Assyria, but was in fact deposed by them, and the king Adad-apla-iddina was placed on the throne as a vassal of the king and was then married to Ashur-bel-kala's daughter. His successors, Marduk-ahi-araba and Marduk-zer-ix, were also Assyrian vassals. Nabu-shuma-libur was the final king and was nominally independent because of the nomadic incursions in the region. Primarily the Aramaeans had broken Assyrian power, and they were able to assert a sort of nominal independence, as good as that was in this period. In 1026, possibly, we've discussed dates before, see our little discussion about that. In 1026, Nabu-shuma-libur, the final king, was deposed by the Aramaeans, and no kingdom ruled in Babylon for over 20 years. The dynasties listed on the Babylonian king list are not always necessarily in order. Some of them possibly ruled at the same time, and Dynasty 5 is an example of that, because Dynasty 5 of Babylon did not actually rule from Babylon. It was instead a sort of revived Sealand empire, which was mostly based around the southern areas of Mesopotamia. And this dynasty may have also been ruled by a Kassite clan, though there is some contention among scholars whether that is the case or not. The first known king of this dynasty, Simbar-shippak, ruled for 17 years, and was then killed by his successor, Ea-mukin-zeri, who ruled for less than 1 year. During the short reign of his successor, Kashushu-nadin-ahi, Regular offerings to the temples were suspended. It seems that in this era, the excesses of Babylon, the great wealth of Mesopotamia, was beginning to dry up, and they could not even make the regular offerings to keep the gods happy. Dynasty 6, the so-called Bitbazi Kassite tribe, seized power in the region of Babylon and constituted a new Babylonian empire, sort of. They actually moved the capital from Babylon to a more defensive position called Qarqar, under the reign of the king Ulumash Shakan Sumi. Ultimately, they were deposed when the Aramaeans sacked Babylon again, and presumably also Qarqar. Only a single king is known, at least in my research, about Dynasty 7, which is regarded as an Elamite dynasty. The later rulers do not seem to regard this king as a foreigner. Perhaps he was simply descended from one of the Elamite marriage alliances. This king, Mar Biti Apla Usur, was also in turn deposed by the Aramaeans. Dynasties 8 and 9, also known as the Dynasty of E, was the first one which is acknowledged to be sort of native Babylonian. Whether that means Amorite or maybe actually Sumerian, not entirely clear. And also the Dynasty was known to be from multiple families. Essentially, once again, dynastic crisis and whatnot would compel the changing of hands. The first king of Dynasty 8, Nabi Mukin Apli, continued to endure the Aramaean attack for 36 years. In this time, he lost access to the hinterlands, and he was unable to celebrate festivals. Once again, this shows that the massive disruption is not only causing the empires to fall apart, but in these cities which had the tradition stretching all the way back to the Copper Age, or at least the early dynastic period of having the city center covered by walls and controlling a vast hinterland of outlying farms and growing plains, that was being challenged in this era. This is a period in which kings, even kings of Babylon, are unable to essentially exert this sort of authority that they have done for thousands of years. His son, another short reign, Ninurta Kuduri Usur II, reigned for 8 months and 12 days, and then was succeeded by his brother, Mar Ibi Ahi Adina, of whom little is known. We only know that by 920 the Assyrian king list notes a different ruler in Babylon. This ruler, Shamash Madamek, and Nabu Shuma Ukin I, both warred with the Assyrians of this period. Nabu Shuma Ukin's son, Nabu Apla Adina, also clashed with them, but also oversaw a short period of revival. This period is more or less characterized by less and less literary sources. As literacy declined, as the Dark Age went on, there's less to actually keep track of, despite the fact this occurred in a period that theoretically is taking place after the collapse. But from what we do know, it seems to be back and forth, one king after another, short reigns filled with conflict, raiding, and warfare. This finished when the Assyrians invaded Babylon, sacked the city, and killed Naba Apla Adina. Shalmaneser III was then able to install a vassal governor. The chaotic period between Shutruk-Nanu's overthrow of the Kassites and its final subjugation lasted 300 tumultuous years.
So, as we mentioned, despite some disputes over the exact dates, around the year 1077 B.C.E., Assyria finally enters the same sort of collapse stage that many other empires experienced earlier on. And as we mentioned, there's a whole wide variety of factors that led to this: weakness of leadership, Aramaean migrations, disasters in foreign areas, disrupting trade, becoming increasingly involved in increasingly expensive foreign wars and conquests, a problem the Romans would discover in their own good time. But whatever the case would be, you see a period that follows, about 160 years, a little more, but roughly 160 years, in which Assyria seems to be on the verge of complete destruction. There are references to the hostile tribes of the Zagros Mountains pitching their tents upon the foot of Ashur itself. That's probably hyperbole, but the idea was that Assyria had been pushed back to its core territories, its core cities, and had lost almost everything that it had conquered in the previous centuries. But, despite this, Assyria's position actually isn't as bad as it might first appear. Yes, they've lost much, but again, their core territories do remain mostly intact. The major fortified cities, like Ashur, are never successfully besieged, and by some accounts aren't even attacked during this period. And while tribal groups, Aramaeans, and others do press upon them from all sides, they are successfully held back from the Tigris Valley, thus meaning that Assyria does have at least some agricultural hinterlands still under their control. But perhaps most significantly, unlike Babylon, for example, The Assyrian royal dynasty remains in power. Power seems to pass more or less smoothly from king to king throughout this period, which means there aren't internal power struggles, there aren't civil wars, there aren't upheavals and uprisings. In short, even though it's definitely the weakest it's been in a very long time, the Assyrians do have the core resources they need and the stability they need to begin pushing out once again, once the leadership is there and the economic position is there.
Perhaps they learned the lesson, because as we discussed last episode, one of the major events that brought the Assyrians here was a dynastic struggle between two different pretenders fighting for the throne.
Fortunately, the Assyrians won't learn that lesson for too long. Dynasties seem to have that problem over and over again. Around the year 911 B.C.E., everything seems to change. By a sort of quirk of history, this empire, which had been reduced to a rump of its former self, was still probably the most stable in the region. And in that year, 911, a king known as Adad-nirari II comes to power. And while, again, we don't want to fall too deep into the well of great man history, he does seem to bring the kind of forward-looking leadership and ambition back to Assyrian politics they've been missing for a century and a half at this point. Almost as soon as he is on the throne, Adad-nirari orders his nobles and his people to organize a large army to conduct one of the first large-scale military campaigns that Assyria has conducted in decades. In this, he launches a massive campaign that was really all turned toward one single goal. He attacked the various Aramaean groups and tribes which had settled along the fringe of the Tigris Valley, which was considered to be the Assyrian homeland. And indeed, looking at some of the living lists and other histories of this period, the Assyrians, in a very modern way, kind of categorize this war as a war for national survival. This is a war against their enemies to preserve their very way of life. And in this, he was extremely successful, as we also pointed out. While the decentralization of the Aramaeans had made them very dangerous, it also made them easy pickings for a strong central force to attack. Over the course of the next few years, the exact number of years is debated based upon various things. Most of what we now call the Jazira plain is freed of Aramaean influence, and the Assyrians once again basically stake claim to the various villages, towns, and smaller cities that surround this region. This emboldens them enough, and also probably enriches their economy enough, that Adad-nirari decides to launch a campaign against Babylon. He meets the forces of the king Shamash-Mudamik on the field of battle and defeats him. Now, this is not some massive war to conquer Babylon. Not really. Probably much like his other wars, for Adad-nirari, this was a war to kind of retake what he saw as traditional Assyrian territory. He claimed a small but significant chunk of land, thus more or less finishing out his control of most of northern Mesopotamia, but in it, again, proving that Adad-nirari was a clever king as well as an ambitious one. Rather than launch, another series of wars and continue to push against Babylon, he instead offers the king a treaty. Shamash-Mudamik is quite eager to not have the Assyrians beating on his northern doorway, and the two agree to basically settle the border on the new lines, and for the next 80 years or so, the two kingdoms are at peace. Well, around the year 891, Adad-nirari dies, and while his name isn't celebrated as one of the great kings of the Neo-Assyrian period, in a very real sense, we can consider him the father of this new empire. He's the one who sort of shook off the rust of previous centuries, and basically restored the Assyrians' pride, as well as restoring enough of their empire, or their old empire, they could conceivably begin to move outward once again. He's succeeded in power by his son, Tukulti-Ninurta II, who reigns for about a decade. 891 to 883 are the rough years we put upon his reign. And by and large, Tukulti-Ninurta seems to be more or less continuing his father's policies. He presses deeper against the Aramaeans and the Neo-Hittites. He launches raids into what we now call Central Turkey or Anatolia. He has some success in extracting tribute from the Neo-Hittite kingdoms that formed in the wake of the collapse there. He also claims to have fought a war against the Medes, one of the new powers in Iran, and defeated them. Though, reading between the lines, looking at archaeology, the records of the Medes and the Babylonians as well, it seems like, Tukulti-Ninurta was able to defeat the Medes in battle and demand they pay tribute to him and acknowledge him as a great king, etc., he wasn't really able to exert any real political control over the Iranian plateau at this time. The Medes are more or less left to continue their consolidation of power there, and in fact, clashes between the Assyrians and the Medes became increasingly common in the centuries to come. But at the end of Tukulti-Ninurta's reign in 883, which brings to power probably one of the first great, or at least infamous kings of the Neo-Assyrian period, Ashur-Nazir-Pal II. Now, Ashur-Nazir-Pal reigns for quite some time, 883 to 859 by many accounts, so almost 30 years upon the throne. If we can consider Adad-Nirari the father of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, Ashur-Nazir-Pal is really its architect. He sets not only the major policies and political structure that will basically dictate how the empire expands, he also establishes the policies that will very firmly establish the infamy of the Neo-Assyrian period. To quote from George Rowe's book Ancient Iraq, that looking upon the statue of Ashur-Nazir-Pal that was found in Nimrud, there is, quote, no smile, no piety, almost no humanity in his face. Nothing but the rigid attitude of a conceited despot, the aquiline nose of a bird of prey, the straight-looking eyes of a chief who demands absolute obedience, and in his hands the mace and the spear. At first, Ashur-Nazir-Pal II doesn't seem all that different from his predecessors, however. Again, almost as soon as he comes to power, he calls up the military. In fact, it becomes pretty standard for Assyrian kings to call up the army yearly for campaigns at this point.
The Neo-Assyrians did at some point too, but obviously there was a big period in which they could not afford those sort of expeditions.
And Ashur-Nazir-Pal, for the first couple of years of his reign, in fact, almost the first decade of his reign, is going to conduct massive campaigns, or at least by his accounts, massive campaigns, again, into the Zagros Mountains, along the upper Tigris Valley, into what we now call Kurdistan, Anatolia, Iran, those regions. Now, partly these new raids by Ashur-Nazir-Pal were against rebellious tribes and vassals who were maybe not so keen on paying tribute to Assyria, and these were mostly crushed with astounding brutality, setting the tone for the rest of Ashur-Nazir-Pal's reign, and really the rest of the Neo-Assyrian period itself. But the reality is that these raids had a larger goal. Ashur-Nazir-Pal wasn't just trying to extract tribute, wasn't just trying to weaken his various enemies. There was a larger goal in mind. His target was to neutralize the various Aramaean kingdoms which had emerged in the wake of the Hittite collapse. In particular, he was trying to reduce the city of Bit Adini to tributary status. Now, you might ask, well, what's so significant about this particular city? In and of itself, nothing much. But that city was the last major obstacle blocking overland routes to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, one of the great ambitions of Assyria, both in the past and currently under this new king, was to gain access to a window upon the sea and the lucrative trade and resources that came from it. With Bit Adini reduced, Ashur-Nazir-Pal could undertake what becomes known to historians as the Syrian expedition of 877 BCE. Now, this expedition is chronicled quite extensively by the Assyrians and by Ashur-Nazir-Pal himself, who was always keen to claim the glory of his various campaigns. What we do know is, moving from Bit Adini down to the cities of Carchemish and Antioch, and then across the Orontes rivers to the coast, the Assyrian army moved swiftly and brutally, sacking cities along the way, defeating various armies, and by all accounts, basically catching everyone by surprise. At this period of time, Syria was divided among various Aramaean and Neo-Hittite kingdoms and principalities, often individual city-states and surrounding territories. And these entities were mostly engaged in petty feuds and wars with each other. They were completely unprepared for Ashur-Nazir-Pal's forces to sweep down, and he defeated them with relatively little effort and extracted considerable tribute from them. To quote the Assyrian chronicles themselves on this matter, I cleaned my weapons in the deep sea and performed sheep offerings to the gods. The tributes of the coast from the inhabitants of Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Mahalata, Myza, Kaisa, Amuru, and of Arvad, which is an island in the sea, gold, silver, tin, copper, containers, linen garments with multicolored trimmings, large and small monkeys, ebony, boxwood, ivory from walrus tusks. This tribute I received, and they embraced my feet. Once these initial raids were conducted and tributes collected, Ashur-Nazir-Pal then, upon returning to the Tigris-Euphrates region, heavily fortified these regions to make sure the route would remain open. Several new fortified sites, such as Tushan, Kar Ashur-Nazir-Pal, roughly Fortress Ashur-Nazir-Pal, and Nebati Ashur were constructed, thus ensuring that the Assyrian army could maintain control over the roads that moved westward, and making sure their armies could move to the coast at will to presumably once again plunder it at their heart's content. But it's important to note that this raid, much like Assur-Nazir-Pal's other conquests to the north, south, and east, aren't conquests in the way that we would think of them. For the most part, when the Assyrians, or the Neo-Assyrians of this period, moved into a region, they didn't conquer it, they didn't annex it, they didn't set up a local governor and a garrison. Oftentimes, they would demand local leaders pay tribute and swear obedience to the king, but these were more like raids. Really, to go back to the beginning here for a second, kind of like what you might expect a raider army out of Fallout or Mad Max to do rather than an actual empire. Assur-Nazir-Pal has not quite taken that step into an imperial age just yet. You see, during this early phase of the Neo-Assyrian period, the Assyrian Empire, if we can even really call it an empire yet, operates under what some historians call the district system. Basically, every region that Assyria either directly or indirectly controlled was divided up into one of two types of districts. The core districts of the empire are roughly those regions along the great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. In theory, these were under the direct control of the king. In practice, great noble families and landowners sworn as vassals to the king controlled most of it. In these areas, the peoples were considered citizens of Assyria. They paid taxes. They performed military services for the king. They were citizens of the nation. They received the protection of the king's justice in here. They received the benefits of public works and land reclamation projects. The state, in turn, in theory at least, served them to some degree. The outer districts beyond this, however, were considered vassal states. Local leadership remained, local rulers won power, but these were subordinated to Assyria and expected to pay annual tribute, their own form of taxation. However, unlike the taxes expected to be paid by Assyrian subjects, these tributes could be truly ruinous. In fact, there are references in some Assyrian texts calling these districts the hunting grounds. And in fact, it was not unusual for annually the Assyrian army to muster itself and march around the frontiers, basically visiting these various districts and saying, by the way, if you'd like to pay some tribute, I am here. If you don't, I am here with all my army.
I heard one lecturer say that less charitably it's called extortion.
It does seem to be something of a protection racket. To put this into perspective, the Assyrians, again, were massive record keepers in this regard, and we actually know, for the most part, what they took. This particular account was taken, I believe, from the year 860, roughly, although it probably hasn't changed too much from the year, and lists the tribute taken from one such district. This district was called Bit Zamani. According to the accounts, that year, the Assyrians accepted 40 chariots, 460 horses, 2 talents of silver. The weight of a talent varies from culture to culture, but it's roughly 70 pounds. 2 talents of gold, 100 talents of lead, 100 talents of copper, 300 talents of iron, 2,000 copper pans, 1,000 copper pots, bowls, and cauldrons, 1,000 brightly colored garments of wool and linen, tables and couches made of ivory overlaid with gold taken from the ruler's palace. So yes, the local king gave his furniture up, in addition to 2,000 heads of cattle, 5,000 sheep, and 15,000 slaves. Again, one district for 1 year paid that much to spare themselves from the Assyrian wrath. To call this a protection racket and extortion scheme perhaps says too little. This system, again, I think George Rowe puts it best when he says the Assyrian Empire operated on 2 principles: fear and the forced redistribution of wealth. Annually, the Assyrian state extracted huge amounts of wealth from the surrounding territories they had subdued and brought it to the center. And partly this was used to enrich the king and his nobles, given to warriors and leaders and troops as rewards. But a lot of it just fed right into the treasury. The grandiose building projects, the mass temples, the land reclamation projects, the walled cities, the grand palaces. The vast majority of this was paid for by blood money, taken at the point of a spear. Now, the problem, of course, is that while the short-term benefits of this extortion are significant, in the long term it's not really stable. Because, well, 2 reasons. 1, you can only squeeze blood from a stone for so long. And 2, it's really only kept in check by a combination of Assyria's military power and fear of the king's vengeance. Now, Assur-Nazir-Pal himself was very good at instilling fear in the king's vengeance. Those who revolted against him, or those who refused to pay him tribute, were brutally punished, and those systematic punishments were then lavishly celebrated as public records, and monuments were built to them.
One inscription from him reads, "I felled 50 of their fine men with the sword, burnt 200 captives from them, and defeated in a battle on the plains 332 troops. With their blood I dyed the mountain red like red wool, and the rest of them the ravines and torrents of the mountain swallowed. I carried off captives and possessions from them. I cut off the heads of their fighters, and built there within a tower before their city. I burnt their adolescent boys and girls." A second one reads, "In strife and conflict I besieged and conquered the city. I felled 3,000 of their fine men with the sword. I captured many troops alive. I cut off some of their arms and hands. I cut off of the others their noses, ears, and extremities. I gouged out the eyes of many troops. I made one pile of the living and one of heads. I hung their heads on trees around the city."
To continue in that vein, he goes on to say in another quote, or another inscription, "I built a pillar against the city gate, and I flayed all the chieftains who had revolted, and covered the pillars with their skin. Some I walled up alive within it, others I impaled upon stakes." But there's also another irony. While Assur-nazir-pal was certainly a brutal king, and in fact most other Neo-Assyrian kings will be equally brutal in their own ways, many of his most famous achievements fall in entirely other areas. At the end of his reign, Assur-nazir-pal decided to construct a new capital city, more centrally located, perhaps to better manage his empire. A new city, known as Nimrud, which is just south of modern Mosul, will be constructed. This city will not only be a grand military center, fortification, and of course palace king, will also be the center of a massive land reclamation and irrigation project which would settle thousands of people upon new lands. In addition to this, a massive palace was constructed which includes some of the finest examples of Mesopotamian art ever found. The massive guardian bulls, the winged lions, images of gods and warriors, great hunting scenes, things of this nature. It also included some remarkable achievements in architecture and engineering, including what some archaeologists might think is the world's first air conditioning system, using moving water and air to keep the palace cool. In addition to his palace structure, Assur-nazir-pal also ordered the construction of large museums and libraries, in which would be preserved and carefully copied the histories, great works, and mythologies of the past. In fact, many of the great works of Mesopotamian history and mythology that we have today come from Nimrud's libraries. While it's not unfair to say that this city was funded by the same treasure he was grinding out of the people he oppressed, this strange celebration of art and learning and literature and science which the king seemed to take quite a delight in based on his own personal accounts and chronicles, sits as a strange counterpoint to his brutality. In addition to that, upon the completion of this grand city, Assur-nazir-pal ordered a celebration in honor of his new city and his new palace. 69,000 guests attended, and supposedly the feasting lasted for 10 days. All those who attended, which did not just include great Assyrian leaders and nobles, but also some of the leaders of surrounding territories, were all given lavish gifts upon the completion. A final inscription notes, "The happy people of all the lands, together with the people of Kalku, for 10 days I feasted, wined, bathed, anointed, and honored, and sent them back to their lands in peace and joy." In a very real sense, it almost seems like an entirely different person to the man who is building monuments to his own bloodthirst.
The center of the Assyrian Empire at this point was different from the provinces. The home cities, Assur, Nineveh, Nimrud, and later the fourth city, Dur-Shurtikan, are more or less directly ruled over by the emperor. One of them is the capital, but they all have a special place in Assyria. And in fact, as we said, the massive amount of tribute that's coming out of these raiding expeditions and extortion rackets is essentially funding these massive amount of building projects, new temples, the construction of brand new sites. These areas often enjoy special privileges. Sometimes the Assyrian monarchs would exempt them from certain taxes. At times they would all be beneficiaries of the spoils of his plunder, in addition to his high lords and his troops. In a real way, Assyria is referred to by some historians as the First Empire, not the Akkadian, Because what the Akkadian does theoretically incorporate two different peoples, the Sumerians and the Akkadians. The Neo-Assyrians are essentially ruling over a massive amount of people with various languages, various cultures, in a really significant amount of space. Areas that were formerly independent kingdoms, or even empires unto themselves, are now subjugated within, and more or less this massive amount of treasure and power and wealth and influence and even labor, as often the tribute comes in the form of slaves and corvée labor, is being used to build up the wealth and influence and luxury in those cities, or else continue to expand the borders and fortify their holdings and more or less insulate the imperial core from disaster. This is a model that's been repeated a number of times. It looks very similar to what Rome would do, expanding into new regions and using their resources and their spoils to bring back to Italy and the Roman city in particular. It's what the European colonialism did, basically spraying across the world and harvesting the resources and manpower places as so far away as the Americas and Africa and the Indian subcontinent to build up the industry base back in the home continent.
Around the year 858 B.C.E., Assur-nazir-pal dies, or to use the Assyrian expression, went to his destiny.
If this was the ocean dub, he'd be going to a different dimension.
Was replaced by his son, who would reign as Shalmaneser III for the next 34 years. Now, Shalmaneser III, in many ways, again, is very much like his father. In fact, in some ways, he's more warlike. As far as we know, he spends 32 of his 34 years at war, and actually is so often on campaign, he rarely even visits Nimrud. At Nimrud, the new capital, we find numerous obelisks, stone tablets, clay tablets, bronze inscriptions, chronicling his various wars. And he talks about launching wars north into Armenia, attacking and conquering the Cilician Gates in Anatolia, moving down and extracting tribute from the region of Syria-Palestine, and even sending expeditions through Mesopotamia all the way to the Persian Gulf.
It should be noted that Armenia in ancient days is a good deal further west than it is today.
On the surface, Shalmaneser seems to be another grand conquering king, a fine addition to the conquering kings that had come before him. But in fact, situations both within Assyria and without were changing in ways that would stress his ability to lead, and actually almost bring the Assyrian state, the newly born Assyrian state, to disaster. See, unlike Assur-nazir-pal, who mostly had to fight small states, independent cities, tribal groups, and totally unprepared peoples, everyone at this point kind of knew what the Assyrians were, kind of knew what they were about, and kind of knew either cough up your treasure or sharpen your swords. By this point, essentially, new kingdoms and new coalitions were forming. The days of easy pickings and quick raids were rapidly coming to an end. North, around the Lake Van region, in or beyond Armenia, a new kingdom called Urartu was beginning to form. Shalmaneser mentions going to war with them several times, and while he claims to have crushed them totally, it should be noted that over the next couple of centuries, Urartu will be Assyria's most dangerous enemy and major rival. Total victory, perhaps, is a bit optimistic. In addition to this, Shalmaneser mentions also pushing eastward and fighting with the Medes and their allies, the Persians. And again, victory is claimed, but in a very real sense, it doesn't seem like that victory actually achieved much. In fact, by the end of his reign, the Medes will have consolidated almost total control over the eastern parts of Persia, pushing westward almost inexorably from this point on. Numerous future wars lay in that frontier. In fact, when Shalmaneser attempted to repeat his father's grand Syrian expedition in 856 BCE, and in fact would talk grandiosely about smashing like pots, an expression they love in the ancient world, the cities of the coast, of occupying Bit Adini and fortifying it. He calls this new city Kar Shulman-Shaded, which is roughly the fortress of Shalmaneser in this case. The reality is that when he actually does push into Syria, he actually fights a coalition. The various Neo-Hittite states, along with the newly arisen Phoenicians and the remaining Aramaean tribes in the region, have actually come together into a new military alliance with one goal: beat the Assyrians. And it's interesting. We do know that both now in 856 and in the future, in both 841 and 838, when Shalmaneser tries again and again to conquer this region, while he does defeat this coalition in the field, there's ample evidence that he actually beats their army in the field and drives them off. But he's never able to marshal enough strength to actually besiege the cities. Cities like Damascus, Hana, Tyre, Sidon, as well as several cities in Israel, actually successfully resist Now, most of these are willing to pay at least some tribute in order to make the Assyrians go away. Shalmaneser is not able to claim even a fraction of the treasures that his father had carried off. And so, while these raids were certainly grandiose and looked good upon his inscriptions, in practice they didn't actually achieve all that much compared to the effort that was put into them. Another example of this is between his Assyrian campaign, around 850, an opportunity arises to take control of Babylon. A civil war breaks out between Marduk Zakir Shumi, who calls himself the rightful king of Babylon, and a younger brother who tried to wrest the crown from him with the aid of the Aramaeans, who will play a major role in Babylon as well. Assyria basically moves in to support Marduk Zakir Shumi, probably with promises of either lands or perhaps even vassalage. And with Assyrian help, the king ends this war very easily and does defeat the various rebels who were supporting his brother. The problem was, Marduk Zakir Shumi wins a great deal from this war. In fact, with Assyrian help, he's able to consolidate and control over most of southern Mesopotamia and the sea land. In exchange, he gives a treaty of friendship to Shalmaneser, but no actual territory, and Babylon refuses to accept formal vassalage. And the fact that Shalmaneser accepts this and doesn't press the issue says a lot about the actual relative weakness of Assyria compared to the fearsome reputation it would soon develop. To make a bad situation worse, the last couple of years of Shalmaneser's reign, when he's an old man, a massive rebellion breaks out inside Assyria. This rebellion lasts for 5 years. Now, to call it a rebellion is perhaps incorrect. In many ways, this might be called a revolution. 27 cities, including several major cities, and one imperial city, led by the crown prince, Ashur-Dananaplu, so the eldest son of the king, raised up in revolt. Now, why this is significant? If the firstborn son of the king is doing this, it's not because he wants to claim the throne, or at least not because Shalmaneser was old at this point. He would not live much longer. This was a war essentially trying to change the fundamental nature of the Assyrian Empire. Not so much on behalf of the provinces being looted, I don't think they care too much about that, but essentially it's the rural nobility, it's the common citizens who are rebelling against the power of the great Assyrian landlords and the special privileges of the imperial cities that they resented very deeply. They wanted fundamental change, they wanted more direct control by the imperial state, they wanted either an end to privileges or a sharing of privileges. They wanted, again, a reorganization of how the political power and economic and bureaucratic structures of the nation worked. In fact, there's even some talk of consolidating new territories directly into the state at this point. Now, while it could be argued that these rebels were fighting for a good cause, and probably thought they had a good chance to win with the crown prince at their head, Shalmaneser, whether out of jealousy or anger or real politics, decided this was too dangerous to continue and ordered it suppressed. He immediately announces that one of his younger sons is his heir, and he appoints the young Shamshi-Adad to lead the army against it. And for 5 long years, Shamshi-Adad will campaign against the rebels and ultimately crush them systematically, driving his brother to flee into exile. The fate of Ashur-Dananaplu remains unknown. I assume he escaped, if only because Shamshi-Adad would have certainly made a public example of him otherwise. But we don't honestly know. Perhaps the younger brother decided to do his elder brother a favor at the end, hard to say. But in 824 B.C.E., just before the fighting ends, Shamshi-Adad becomes king, known as Shamshi-Adad V. But he will not reign for all that long. In fact, he only reigns for about 13 years. That's not a short reign, but it's definitely not a long one. And he spends almost the entirety of his reign trying to put the empire back together, because many of the provincial vassals had taken this as a good opportunity to revolt themselves, to break away and cease paying tribute to Assyria. He has to systematically reclaim these territories and reinforce upon them that Assyria was not to be disobeyed. In addition to this, the northern rivals of Urartu, as well as the Medes, will begin to press against Assyrian borders, become significantly more powerful during this period. And there's not a whole lot that Shamshi-Adad can do about it. He spends, again, most of his reign suppressing revolts inside Assyria and reconquering the 27 cities that backed his brother. He dies relatively young, in fact, in 811 B.C.E., and power passes into the hands of his son, Adad-nirari III, who was known as a child king. Now, he probably wasn't a young child. We suspect he was probably about maybe 10 or 11 years old, perhaps a little older this time. But he was not old enough to assume the massive responsibilities of leading the Assyrian state. And in fact, the first 4 years of his reign will be his mother, Samuramat, who basically heads up a regency council that really rules Assyria. Interesting side note here, the actual historical Samuramat is mostly unknown. She's very only briefly mentioned. She doesn't have power for that long. But legends based on her, the Persians basically spin her story into the legend of the Queen Semiramis. Semiramis was this legendary queen of Assyria who had conquered all the lands around her, was known for her cruelty and lust and splendor and magical powers, and upon her death supposedly ascended, became a goddess by some counts. This bears very little resemblance to the actual figure she's based upon, but for a long, long time, the legend of Semiramis is one of the few really widely known pieces of history, such as it was, about Assyria, which has largely been lost until the 1930s. And so, as some historians have said, it's a grand irony that the memory of the Assyrian kings was preserved in antiquity through the guise of a woman. But take from that what you will. Nonetheless, within 4 years, Adad-nirari III basically assumes control of the government himself, and he himself seems to have been a relatively effective leader. By this point in time, most of Assyria has been pacified, and he feels confident enough to undertake foreign expeditions once again. And the records of his admittedly decently sized reign, he will reign until the year 783 BCE. He had some success in extracting tributes from the various Neo-Hittite states. He warred against various Philistine cities. He forced the Phoenicians, the Israelites, the Edomites, and a few others to pay tribute to him. He conducted a large campaign in Syria in 806 BCE, which seems to have been fairly successful. It looks like, in a lot of ways, Assyria is back to top form. Even the walled city of Damascus is forced to pay tribute, and temporarily incorporated as a vassal state, essentially succeeding where his grandfather had failed. He even will receive tribute from the Medes after launching a brief campaign to the east. And in fact, some historians think that Samarama herself might have actually warred with the Medes successfully. Part of the reason why it's the Medes and the Persians who keep her legend alive, as it were. But even here, Iran proves a tough nut to crack, and they cannot really assert any direct control over it, despite perhaps wanting to. Despite Adad-nirari's successes, the core nature of Assyria as a raider state, more or less, hadn't actually changed. Unfortunately, while Adad-nirari will reign until 783 BCE, he's also relatively young when he died. His 4 sons will reign in succession after him. And that's never a good sign when the 4 sons of one king manage to reign in succession with each other. And of these kings, relatively little is actually known. Immediately upon his death, Shalmaneser IV takes the throne. But the records are largely blank about him. He does not seem to have led any massive campaigns. He does not seem to have built any grand temples. In fact, one of the few campaigns of his reign that is actually recorded, he's not even mentioned. In fact, the general in charge of the expedition claims victory in the name of Assyria and doesn't even mention the king, a fact which is actually unprecedented before or after this point.
Some speculate that he has essentially asserted himself as an independent martyr king at that point, a general sent down to pacify a region, bring it back in the empire, but over time he gained so much influence and power that he says, why don't I just be king of this area? And there's little the emperor can do about it in the sad state that they're in.
Indeed. Shalmaneser passes to his destiny in 773 BCE. He is succeeded by Ashur-dan III, who will manage about 17 or 18 years upon the throne. Unfortunately, his reign, while better recorded, records that he unsuccessfully failed to raid Syria, unsuccessfully invading Babylon, and for a major plague breaking out, all considered very bad omens. In addition to this, the liminal lists record that a solar eclipse occurred during his reign, which is also seen as a very bad omen. However, good luck for us, because astrologers can actually pinpoint the month and year of that eclipse, thus actually putting some order to Assyrian records finally. Ashur-dan III dies in 755 BCE and is replaced by his younger brother, Ashur-nirari, who reigns for about 9 years, 754 to 745 BCE. While there are hints and references to records during this period, it seems like a lot of them were destroyed in a palace coup that occurs at the end of his reign. In fact, we're fairly confident that in 745 BCE, Ashur-nirari is actually killed by an uprising in Nimrud, an uprising which places Tiglath-Pileser III upon the throne. Now, Tiglath-Pileser will claim to be the 4th son and actually a member of that dynasty. But in reality, almost everything we have says that he is an usurper who ends that dynasty and starts a new one, even if he's pretending he didn't do that.
By most accounts, this does appear to be the final end of the Adast dynasty, and they're replaced by a different one. So, if we're keeping track, it's different depending on whether you take the middle chronology or the ultra-long or ultra-short or whatever, but the dates I was looking at place the Adast dynasty as reigning from roughly 1700 BCE to 745 BCE. That's 955 years. That's a hell of a reign for one dynasty.
Now, Tiglath-Pileser III will prove to be a relatively powerful and effective leader, so in a sense his coup was good for Assyria. By the time he assumes power, however, Assyria, despite having a strong start, had suffered from almost a 36-year period of general political, military, and economic instability. In fact, it looked very much like the Assyrian state might die stillborn, as it were. Although, they're not alone in this. This is also a period of instability in Babylon. One of Babylon's dynasties falls, and as a period that they refer to as the age when there was no king in the country occurs. The Persians also begin their migration to the western parts of Iran at this period. And while the Medes continue to consolidate control over the Iranian plateau, they're also having to fight wars to do so. Uruk uses this period of Assyrian weakness to establish its dominance of the Armenian region. In fact, builds a very strong state built on military service to the king. The records we have from Uruk, which can be read, seem to indicate that while the central power in that nation was the king and his vast royal estates, land was given for military service, and thus, in sort of a feudal arrangement, the citizens of the nation could enrich themselves by serving their king in war. Other things happen in this period as well. Groups like the Sumerians arrive and actually become allies of the Urartans for a time. So the brief alliance of the cities of Syria breaks apart into infighting and civil war, which ultimately brings the city of Arpad to prominence. All of this comes to an end with Tiglath-Pileser's rise to power. When Tiglath-Pileser III, known by some as the Usurper, takes power in 744, the situation for Assyria changes. Not only will he be able to revitalize the state from the weaknesses it fallen into, he also undertakes a massive reorganization of the empire, which greatly strengthens Assyria, and in a very real sense, completes the transformation into an empire. In fact, in a way, you could almost call Tiglath-Pileser III the true founder of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. As soon as he comes to power, he undertakes a series of massive political, military, and social reorganization to drastically change how the empire functioned. As one historian put it, Assyria had no choice but become an empire or die, and Tiglath-Pileser was strong-willed enough, powerful enough, and popular enough to do it. The first major undertaking of this man's reign was a massive administrative reform, in many ways mirroring what the rebels of years earlier had wanted. He strips many of the great landowners from power and subdivides the royal districts into new territorial divisions, basically making more smaller districts to ensure that no district overlord, as they were called, had too much power over another. In addition to this, he institutes a series of bureaucratic reforms designed to create more central control and oversight, while at the same time allowing for more efficient communication between them. This was intended by and large to reduce the power of large landowners and district lords, but it was also meant to strengthen power with the king directly over his territories. While Assyria never stops extracting tribute, it does cease raiding quite so brutally. Many of its so-called hunting grounds were incorporated as new provinces, meaning that people there were given Assyrian citizenship. And so while they were still required to pay taxes, labor, and military service to the kings, it was perhaps less burdensome than it had been before, and they got at least some slice of the public works pie. Tiglath-Pileser orders the construction of roads, bridges, and canals in these regions. He orders new land reclamation irrigation projects, and orders the construction of new fortifications, cities, and temples. Basically, if the burdens of Assyria hadn't really lightened that much, the benefits of being part of Assyria had increased considerably. Vassals on the fringes, which couldn't be incorporated directly, also see at least some reduction in the tribute demanded from them, and they're no longer subjected to quite the same brutal penalties they had been. Though again, if you rebel against the king, expect to have your skin cut off. That's just kind of the way the Assyrians did things back in the day. One fascinating innovation of this was Tiglath-Pileser orders the construction of what is essentially a national postal service. In addition to road construction projects, they actually create a system of messengers and riders, a pony express in American terms, to move what were called the king's words throughout the region quickly, but also to allow for rapid communication of military threats, mobilizations, tax collection, and also merchant and economic activity. One interesting and amusing side note, everyone's favorite Greek historian Herodotus actually makes note of the Assyrian postal system and commends its efficiency and effectiveness. And would you believe it? The current U.S. Post Office takes its motto, neither rain nor sun nor sleet nor hail, directly from Herodotus, who was supposedly quoting an Assyrian source about their postal system.
Thankfully, if you put too few stamps here, we don't cut your skin off.
In conjunction with this political reform, which proved to be quite effective and relatively popular, Tiglath-Pileser conducts a massive military reform. You see, early on, this includes earlier Assyrian periods as well as the earliest parts of the Neo-Assyrian period, the military was largely composed of a small corps of the royal guard, the king's personal protectors and soldiers, whose ranks were expanded either by calling nobles or crown dependents to pay their feudal service to the king. This is called ilku, by the way, paying either your labor service or your military service to the king, or through the conscription of farmers and laborers and other men to fill up the ranks. It had been reasonably effective, of course, but just like the ancient war-making practices of the early Babylonians and Akkadians and others, it limited you in a lot of ways. The training of your army was rather spotty, and of course the campaign siege was very short. You could only pull men out of the fields for so long before you had to send them back, or the harvest might not come in. Tiglath-Pileser basically creates one of the first standing professional armies in history. Basically, many of the provinces, both the newly incorporated provinces and the recently reorganized ones, paid as part of their taxes fighting men. And these men were not simply paying their dues to the king. They were paid a salary to be soldiers professionally. They were trained, they were equipped uniformly, they were professional military. And this was an advantage the Assyrians would have that very few other states in this time period would have. And of course, this could also be augmented by conscription if need be, and of course, allies and vassals could be forced to turn their armies over to the Assyrians in these big campaigns. The old methods were still used, but the core of the Assyrian army became increasingly professional, increasingly well-trained, and of course, could theoretically fight any time during the year, which had to be a big surprise to their enemies who were in planting season when the army rolled over the hill and you really couldn't do much about it. Tiglath-Pileser also, more or less, not completely, but more or less disbands the chariot corps and replaces them with cavalry. There's a number of reasons for this. Cavalry is a lot easier to use because it's cheaper to make, it's cheaper to maintain, and horses you need either way. You need fewer horses, you need less equipment. Chariots are really only effective in a couple of situations. They have to fight on flat open terrain, and a lot of Assyria's enemies were in the mountains, in the forest. They're fighting in the Zagros, Tauros. They're fighting in the mountains in Anatolia and northern Syria. Chariots don't work very well there. Cavalry can work there. And they also discover, as pretty much everyone else in history uses cavalry does, that cavalry is great at riding down and killing a retreating enemy. And in fact, again, cavalry becomes a major element of the Assyrian military machine from this point on. And again, from this point on, the chariot becomes kind of a relic of older times. They're still used, but very limited. Finally, socially, Tiglath-Pileser undertakes a massive policy, which is really an extension and expansion of previous ideas, but of the movement of peace. This might be called the Assyrianization of the empire, an attempt to basically disrupt, uproot, and destroy what we would call nationalism or national feelings, and create a uniform culture for the Assyrian state. And this was conducted by a policy of deportation and resettlement. The Assyrian military would move into regions and require the entire population of an area to leave, to pack up their belongings and go. They would be escorted to new lands where they were required to settle. And again, of course, people from these new lands would be taken back to their territories, and populations were moved around and mixed together. The goal of this, again, was to uproot national feelings, as they were called. Connections to the land, local customs, local gods, local cultures, local ancestors, all this stuff. To break these connections, to mix people together, and through through the imposition of Assyrian language and culture and leadership to create, again, a uniform Assyrian state. This has often been harshly criticized both by people at the time and by the enemies of Assyria, who held up this as an example of Assyria's despotism and cruelty, and certainly it had to have been a pretty traumatizing experience for the roughly 4.5 million people we estimate Tiglath-Pileser moved during his reign. But we also know that this was not really as cruel as it might seem upon the surface. The people were forced to move, but they were usually not forced too harshly. In fact, these were not death marches, as were sometimes depicted by later accounts. In fact, we know from the letters of the kings and official records that local governors were under strict orders to ensure that these refugees were fed, clothed, and protected. In fact, in one case, they were ordered to give shoes. Most people didn't own shoes. And, ironically enough, deportation also often came with citizenship and more protection under the Assyrian system. Thus, while it was certainly traumatic at the time, it seemed to be, if not popular, at least reasonably successful. In the short term, the Assyrian system did stabilize considerably. In addition to this resettlement policy also helped to bring some abandoned land back into productivity, and we know from later records in the century that follows, many of these newly resettled provinces would be among some of the most loyal to the Assyrian state and will produce the most effective military units for future Assyrian conquests.
This is not dissimilar to what some other empires do, but it's more drastic and forced than almost any other. In addition to troops, sometimes these people were sent to areas that specifically they wanted building projects done in areas of royal interest. These projects were essentially to take people, and there were benefits to removing them. Essentially the idea of breaking local culture. It's also the idea of taking a group that may be rebellious in their homelands and moving them to a strange place and possibly hostile, they would think, and making them where they're dependent upon the crown. But that group dependent upon the crown is then able to be used on projects they want to have done. And within a few generations, these people more or less assimilate. You have, for example, in the Bible, the 10 lost tribes. Those were individuals who later in Assyria's history are scattered and are sent to the eastern fringes of Assyria and essentially are lost because they just become part of the local culture. They assimilate in, and it is this attempt to forge a new imperial identity, which is not 100% Assyrian either. The Assyrians adopt the Aramaean language alongside Assyrian Akkadian because of its widespread nature throughout the region. In a way, while more forced and more deliberate, this is not so dissimilar to the way the melting pot theory of America. Immigrants would come over, they bring their native language, they bring their customs. Within a few generations, their kids, their grandkids, their great-grandkids would be educated in America, they would feel American, but they'd have a little piece of that culture here. And America has overall adopted many aspects of it while becoming more or less a unified culture coast to coast.
Of course, the irony of this is that it was a two-way street, as mentioned. Part of this process included moving large numbers of Aramaeans. In fact, it is the assimilation of Aramaic language, essentially, as Assyria's, not its official language perhaps, but certainly its lingua franca in the streets. And it's thought that in the long term, this probably actually played more of a role in diluting, diffusing, and finally sort of ending Assyrian culture would have been before this period.
The depictions of royal scribes almost always show two of them copying side by side, one in Akkadian and one in Aramaean.
Using this new military he had forged and the more stable state he was building, Tiglath-Pileser felt confident in using that army to conduct new campaigns to reignite the fear of Assyria and the power of Assyria throughout new lands. We suspect perhaps as early as 744 BC, he launches a number of attacks. His first major campaign was actually to the south, not against Babylon, but actually in its rescue. Babylon in this period was actually feeling pretty severe pressure from movements of the Aramaean tribes, and Tiglath-Pileser basically went down and scattered them. But unlike his predecessor, he demanded the submission of Babylon in turn, and the king of Babylon was really not in a position to refuse him. He also moves back into Syria and defeats a new coalition. Basically, the old anti-Assyrian coalition here had broken apart. But the kingdom of Uruk in the north moved in, supported several favorites, forged a new alliance. In 742 BCE, he invades and breaks this coalition in a rather devastating battle in the city of Qarqar. We know that Uruk does send an army to relieve this, and that too is scattered. In fact, Tiglath-Pileser is so successful in shattering slaughtering these local forces, he actually directly annexes northern Syria into the empire and makes it a district, demanding regular tribute in cities like Damascus and the region of Israel. Through 737 and 736 B.C.E., he pushes further south along the coast and further north into the Zagros Mountain, basically retaking this area from Urartu, and there are accounts backed up by local records that he warred against the Medes and besieged Tehran, all, again, major victories. In 735, he attempted to do the same to Urartu. In fact, he attempted to take their capital city and conquer their entire kingdom. It seems that he was repelled and the capital held, Urartu would remain, but its power would be weakened significantly as a result of this. With the northern and eastern frontiers secured, Tiglath-Pileser felt confident in pushing south once again, and in 734 he ordered an expedition along the Mediterranean coast. The cities of Tyre and Sidon were both not in open revolt, but definitely grumbling because the Assyrians had forbid them from exporting timber to Egypt, a major source of wealth for them. A quick showing of force convinced them that loyalty was the better option. He also moves throughout Palestine and Jordan. There was evidence that cities like Ascalon and Gaza, along with a number of Jewish tribes and kingdoms, were forming a new anti-Assyrian coalition, probably with Egyptian monetary support, and in theory, perhaps Egyptian military support as well. In this case, Tiglath-Pileser personally led the armies there, which was probably kings didn't always do. In this case, he did, and crushed the rebels in a major battle. In 732 BCE, seeing the writing on the wall, as it were, most of these states capitulated. And in fact, in a grand showing of irony, Judah actually requests Assyrian assistance against Damascus in this period, which they do provide. The end result sees Tiglath-Pileser defeating Damascus and their Egyptian backers, annexing Damascus, and also claiming half of Israel as his own territory. This is where the lost tribes come from, because the 10 tribes of that region were uprooted and moved. In addition to this, however, Tiglath-Pileser would really only fight one more major campaign against Babylon in this case. At the same time that the Assyrians are really sort of taking control of the Mediterranean coast and putting a stranglehold upon the trade ports there, another dynastic crisis breaks out in Babylon when an Aramaean chief named Ukin-Zer seizes the city around the year 731 BCE. Responding to protect their friends, allies, and vassals, Tiglath-Pileser leads his last campaign in 728 BCE, sweeping this usurper out of power. But he decides to go a step further. Rather than reinstating the Babylonian king or propping up a local favorite, he enters the city, takes the Hans of Baal in the temple, and proclaims himself king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the whole country, and then proceeds to die the next year.
Of course, Tiglath-Pileser, like his predecessors and successors, also engaged in plenty of horrific violence. To quote one of his inscriptions, "Nabu Ushabshi, their king, I hung up in front of the gates of his city on a stake. His lands, his wife, his sons, his daughters, his property, the treasure of his palace, I carried off. Bit Amukani, I trampled down like a threshing sledge. All of its people and its goods I took to Assyria."
But if Tiglath-Pileser had set the tone for the new Assyrian Empire, he had rebuilt their strength, put them on a solid foundation, it will be the kings that follow him that take Assyria to the height of its might, crushing any possible rivals, extending their power from as far away as the Nile to the center of Iran, from Armenia in the north to the Gulf Coast in the south. But these glories will be fleeting, while Assyria will assert itself and become the superpower of its age. In many ways, it wouldn't last. It couldn't last.
Thanks for listening to Part 1 of Episode 6 of the History Hour with Mr. Kent
and Professor White.
Due to length, we'll split this one in two. Come back next time when we continue our journey through the Iron Age and the final apex of ancient Mesopotamia. You can find us on YouTube, and recently we have begun uploading episodes on Podbean.com as well, which you can find at historyhour.podbean.com, all one word. Thanks for listening. If you enjoy this content, please give us a like, share with your friends, favorite that junk, or even, if you're thinking about being a big history shill, visit our Patreon page. You can follow us for updates on Twitter at The History Hour. See you next time.